The war isn't coming. It's already here. Not fought with missiles, fought with debt. $111 trillion. That's global public debt in 2025, up $8.3 trillion in 1 year alone. This isn't an accident, it's the battlefield. And the real question isn't who will fire the first shot. The question is, who will collapse first? The United States, China, and Russia are locked in an economic death match, each drowning in debt, each printing money like tomorrow doesn't exist, each threatening the others with sanctions, tariffs, and currency wars. But here's what they won't tell you. They're all going down. The only question is the order. This is the story of how 3 superpowers built a house of cards 53 years in the making. Since August 15, 1971, when President Nixon slammed the gold window shut. Every promise broken, every debt unpayable, every empire unsustainable. And in 2025, the dominoes are finally falling.
To understand this moment, we need to go back. August 15, 1971. Camp David. President Richard Nixon meets with 15 advisors, including Treasury Secretary John Connally and a young Paul Volcker. The United States is hemorrhaging gold. The Vietnam War costs escalate. Great Society programs drain reserves. Foreign nations line up to exchange dollars for gold at $35 per ounce. But there's a problem. There isn't enough gold. Not even close. Nixon makes a decision that will reshape the world for 5 decades. He closes the gold window. No more gold conversion. The dollar, and therefore the entire global financial system, is now backed by nothing but trust, nothing but a promise, nothing but debt. The world calls it the Nixon shock. Nixon calls it the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. He's wrong about it being an agreement. Nobody agreed. But he's right about the significance. In that moment, the money system became an experiment. Every currency unlinked from physical assets, every central bank free to print without restraint, every nation able to borrow without limit. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944 with 44 nations in agreement, dies in 15 months. By March 1973, floating exchange rates become the norm. The dollar standard without gold is born, and with it, an era of debt no previous generation could have imagined. Here's what happened next. U.S. debt was $398 billion in 1971. By 2000, $5.7 trillion. By 2008, $10 trillion. Today, $38 trillion. That's a 9,447% increase in 53 years. But the United States isn't alone. China's debt stood at $1.5 trillion in 2008. Today, it's $18.7 trillion. Russia's external debt multiplied tenfold since the fall of the Soviet Union. The pattern is global. The mechanism is identical. Governments realized they could spend today and promise payment tomorrow. Tomorrow never comes. It just becomes more debt, more promises, more tomorrow.
How does it work today? Simple, brilliant, catastrophic. Governments spend more than they collect in taxes. They bridge the gap by selling bonds, IOUs promising to pay later with interest. Who buys these bonds? Central banks, commercial banks, foreign governments, pension funds, all betting that tomorrow the debtor nation will still exist, still function, still pay. But here's the trick they don't advertise. In 2024, global public debt reached $102 trillion, up $5 trillion from 2023 alone. The United States accounts for $38 trillion of that, 34.6% of the world total. China holds $18.7 trillion, 16.1%. Together, these two nations control 51.8% of all government debt on Earth. Not shared, concentrated, and growing. The U.S. military budget for 2025? $850 billion. That's more than the next 9 countries combined. But the U.S. spent $881 billion on debt interest payments in 2024 alone, more than the entire defense budget. Think about that. More money servicing old debts than protecting current borders. The Pentagon's budget could hit $1.5 trillion annually by 2035 if current trends continue, but the interest payments will grow faster. China's story mirrors America's in reverse. While the U.S. borrows to maintain military dominance in consumer spending, China borrows to build infrastructure and manufacturing capacity. But both end up in the same trap. You can't print your way to prosperity. You can only print your way to inflation and eventually collapse. Russia plays a different game. External debt is lower. Energy independence provides a buffer. But sanctions from the Ukraine war force Moscow into dependence on China. Trade between Russia and China hit $244.8 billion in 2024. Over 90% settled in rubles and yuan, bypassing the dollar entirely. This is the weaponization of currency, not just competition, elimination. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus recent additions Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, UAE, Indonesia, and 13 partner countries, now represent 55% of global population and 42% of global GDP measured in purchasing power parity. They're building alternative payment systems, BRICS Pay, the new development bank, China's cross-border interbank payment system, processing yuan transactions independent of SWIFT. As of 2025, CIPS connects 4,800 banks across 185 countries. The dollar still accounts for 59% of global reserves and nearly 90% of foreign exchange transactions in 2024, but that's down from 85% in the 1970s. The trend line points one direction: diversification, de-dollarization, destruction of the single reserve currency system that has existed since 1944. The trap is complete. The U.S. needs the world to keep buying dollars to finance its debt. But using tariffs and sanctions as weapons gives other nations every reason to find alternatives. China needs export markets and energy imports, but faces trade wars that push it toward regional partnerships and local currency agreements. Russia needs access to global finance, but is cut off from SWIFT, forcing shadow banking and cryptocurrency workarounds. They're locked together, mutually dependent, mutually destructive, and all drowning in debt that compounds by the day.
This pattern isn't new. History offers clear precedents. Consider the first time the world tried this experiment. August 1914. The classical gold standard, which had governed international finance since 1821, collapsed when World War I began. Nations needed to print money to fund war efforts. Gold constraints disappeared overnight. The result? Hyperinflation in Germany, revolution in Russia, economic chaos across Europe. The interwar period brought desperate attempts to restore gold-based systems. Britain returned to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war parity. Catastrophic decision. The pound was overvalued. British exports collapsed. Unemployment soared. In September 1931, facing massive gold outflows, Britain abandoned gold again. Sound familiar? It should. The same dynamic that forced Nixon's hand in 1971 forced Britain's in 1931. Foreign claims exceeding gold reserves. Fast forward to the 2008 financial crisis. Total global debt was $177 trillion. Governments worldwide responded with quantitative easing.
Central bank money creation on a scale never before attempted. They didn't just lower interest rates to zero. They went negative in some countries. They didn't just buy government bonds. They bought corporate bonds, mortgage securities, everything. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from $900 billion to $4.5 trillion in 5 years. The rationale? Prevent collapse. The result? Debt explosion. U.S. national debt doubled from $10 trillion in 2008 to $20 trillion by 2016. Global debt surged to $280 trillion by 2020. Then COVID-19 hit, another crisis, another round of money printing. Global debt jumped to $303 trillion in 2021. Now it's $323 trillion in 2024. 3 financial emergencies in 16 years, each solved by creating more debt. Here's the historical pattern. Every debt-based monetary system eventually fails. The temptation to print is irresistible. The political cost of austerity is unbearable. So governments choose more debt, more stimulus, more tomorrow, until tomorrow arrives. The Weimar Republic printed its currency into worthlessness by 1923. Zimbabwe did the same by 2008, reaching an annual inflation rate of 89.76 trillion%, a number so large it's meaningless. Venezuela followed with inflation exceeding 1 million% by 2018. The common thread? Governments spending more than they collect, printing to cover the gap, and discovering too late that you cannot print real wealth. The difference this time? Scale. When Germany's poppy mark collapsed, it affected one nation. When the dollar-based system wobbles, it affects the entire planet. There is no backup, no alternative fully prepared, just competing systems being built in real time while the current one deteriorates. We're watching the setup for the third major monetary regime change in a century. The first ended in 1914. The second began in 1944 and died by 1971. The third, floating fiat currencies backed by nothing but promises, is now 53 years old. The cracks are showing. The question isn't whether it will change again. The question is whether the change will be managed or catastrophic.
Here's the truth they don't want you to understand. This system was designed to fail, not by accident, by necessity. A debt-based monetary system requires perpetual growth, not because growth is good, because without growth, the debt cannot be serviced. The interest compounds, the payments come due. The whole structure collapses. But perpetual growth on a finite planet is impossible. Every economist knows this. Every central banker understands it. They simply pretend otherwise because acknowledging reality means admitting the game is over. The emperor has no clothes. The debt has no solution. 3.4 billion people, almost half of humanity, live in countries where governments spend more on debt interest payments than on either health or education. Let that sink in. Not infrastructure, not defense, just interest. Money paid for the privilege of having borrowed money in the past. Productive spending sacrificed to service unproductive debt. 61 developing countries spend 10% or more of government revenues just on interest payments. For half of developing countries, debt service consumes at least 6.5% of export revenues. These nations can't invest in their futures. They're trapped servicing debts from the past. Meanwhile, their creditors, often wealthier nations and international institutions, collect the interest. The system doesn't lift them up, It keeps them down. The global interest bill reached $921 billion for developing countries in 2024, up 10% from 2023. Debt service for external public debt hit $487 billion in 2023. These aren't investments. These are anchors, chains, mechanisms of extraction disguised as financial assistance. Who profits? Follow the money. International banks collecting interest, wealthy nations holding bonds, currency speculators betting on crises, defense contractors benefiting from geopolitical tensions, commodity traders profiting from volatility. The system concentrates wealth at the top while distributing debt to the bottom. Who loses? Workers whose wages stagnate while cost of living rises. Students buried in debt before entering the workforce. Retirees discovering their pensions were invested in unpayable government bonds. Small businesses crushed by interest rates designed to fight inflation caused by monetary expansion they didn't request. Entire nations in the global south transferring real resources to service dollar-denominated debts they can never fully repay. The war isn't coming. It's already here. It's being fought in currency markets, trade deficits, and central bank policy meetings. The weapons are tariffs, sanctions, and interest rates. The casualties are measured in quality of life, not body counts. But make no mistake, this is war, economic war. And like all wars, it will end with winners and losers, victors and vanquished.
What should you understand from all this? First, inflation isn't an accident. It's a policy. When governments create more money to service debt they can't repay, the currency loses value. That's not a side effect. That's the mechanism. Your savings don't lose purchasing power randomly. They lose it systematically, by design, to reduce the real burden of government debt. Second, de-dollarization isn't a conspiracy theory. It's rational self-defense. When the U.S. uses the dollar as a weapon, sanctions, frozen assets, financial exclusion, other nations are forced to build alternatives or remain perpetually vulnerable. BRICS isn't trying to destroy the dollar because they're enemies of America. They're building alternatives because depending on a currency controlled by someone else is economic suicide. Third, the coming transition will not be gentle. When the Bretton Woods system collapsed between 1971 and 1973, inflation in the United States reached 11%. The stock market lost 48% of its value. Oil prices quadrupled. The global economy entered stagflation, stagnant growth plus high inflation, that lasted a decade. And that was just the transition from gold-backed dollars to pure fiat dollars. The next transition will be from dollar dominance to something else. Nobody knows what, but transitions are never smooth. What can you do? Diversify. Don't hold all your wealth in a single currency. Understand that cash loses value by design. Assets with real utility, property, productive businesses, skills that create value, tend to preserve wealth better than currency during monetary transitions. Learn the history. Knowledge of past crises doesn't predict the next one precisely, but it shows the patterns, and patterns repeat. Most importantly, understand that individual financial decisions happen within systems. You can protect yourself, but you can't stop the system from its trajectory. The debt will continue to grow until it cannot. The currencies will continue to lose value until they do not. The geopolitical competition will continue to escalate until something breaks. Your job isn't to prevent that. Your job is to position yourself so that when it happens, you're not destroyed by it. The investment in knowledge pays the best returns, especially knowledge that others refuse to see.
The United States, China, and Russia are locked in a battle
they all lose unless the system changes. The debt grows, the currency wars escalate, the global population pays the price. But those who understand the game can protect themselves. Those who see the patterns can prepare. Those who study history can avoid repeating it blindly. If this gave you a new perspective, click subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's really happening. The investment in knowledge pays the best returns, especially knowledge that the system doesn't want widely distributed. The war is already here. The question is whether you see it.